Hi everybody, welcome back to this next part of the Tamiya 132 scale Mosquito build. In the first part I made a start on the cockpit assembly in the Tamiya kit, and in this part I'm going to be moving on and finishing the cockpit. But because the assembly is so complex in the Tamiya kit, I'm going to have to break the footage up into two 1 hour sessions. So at the end of this next part, I'll leave a link at the top right hand side of the page, and you'll be able to click on that if you want to move straight on for the second hour. If not, you can always save it and come back later and watch it in your own time. But I didn't want to lose any footage at all from the work that I've done. The build has taken probably something like 15 hours just to do the cockpit. So I hope that the decision to break this one up into two separate episodes is the right one. So there's lots to get through, so I'll bring the camera over and we can make a start on the next part of the cockpit. Okay, so in the last episode I built the pilot's seat with the seat armour. Remember that from part one. And in part two I'm going to kick off by building the Navigator's seat as well, and this is a little bit simpler than the pilot seat, but there's one or two things that we've just got to check out. It's made a little bit more complicated because of having to deal with this window in the headrest position on the Navigator's seat, and Tamiya mould this part as a whole transparent part, and we have to mask off the window. That is a better solution, I think, than trying to fit a separate circular transparency in a solid plastic part. We just have to mask this off and paint the green, and then we can take the masking off, obviously. The assembly is a bit more complicated than that though, because we've got this separate window which goes on the back, and I'm going to be painting these parts separately, and that's because this almost is like a piece of double glazing, and I'm concerned about getting debris and dust and maybe even a little bit of paint in between the windows. So I'm going to paint them separately, make sure that they're absolutely clean, and then just gently tack this rear window in place, probably with some acrylic glue or some canopy glue, something like that. Just something that's not going to fog the transparencies. But what I can do is use the masking sheet to mask these off to start with. I always like to try and get a piece of masking tape onto transparencies as quickly as I can, because I find that they get marked and get bits of dust on them. So to get them protected straight away is generally a good idea, I think. Now Tamiya do provide a masking sheet for all the transparencies in the kit, but it's not pre-cut, so I'm using the Etched masking set, which is this one, and this came in the Big Sin set, so I already had this. And the benefit of the Etched sets, of course, is that they're pre-cut, so we don't have to worry about cutting a piece, a circular piece, out of the Tamiya masking sheet. I probably wouldn't even attempt to do that, actually. If I didn't have the Etched sheet, the pre-cut one, I'd probably cut this circular window out with a punch and die set. So let's just get those protected first of all. Make sure that we get the correct mask for the correct location. As always with masking, just make sure that the edges are burnished down properly so we don't get any paint creep underneath the mask. Because I'm not gluing these parts together at this stage, I'm going to make another couple of masks for the rear faces of these transparencies, just to make sure that they're absolutely protected. Okay, so those masks are applied to both sides of both parts now, so the transparencies are nice and protected. This upper bulkhead, the transparent bulkhead, has a grab handle on it up here, and we'll be replacing that with some etched brass, so that needs to come off, but we're going to have to be very, very careful with this. I don't want to lose the detail of the window surround up here. The other thing to be aware of when you're dealing with transparent plastic is that it's quite often a lot more brittle than a solid coloured plastic. For some reason, I don't know what it is, but it's often the case, so you just have to be a little bit more gentle when cutting transparent plastic. So a nice sharp knife blade to remove that moulding. So that's the transparency cleaned up. We've got rid of the plastic grab handle that was moulded in. And I always like to mask off transparencies when I'm working nearby, when I'm doing sanding particularly. Just in case you slip, or the other thing is that the sanding dust gets into the transparency and it's often quite difficult to get it off. It must be static or something like that that makes the debris of the sanding just grip to the window. Obviously we don't want that, so masking it up just makes sure that we're not going to do any damage whilst we're getting the part ready. So this now fits to the solid plastic bulkhead here at the top. There are a couple of brackets to give a nice firm fixing for that. But before I do, I'm going to modify this area down here at the bottom because there's some Edward etched parts to fit down here. So we're going to have to do some cleanup, get rid of the moulding and replace it with some etched brass. That's all nice and smooth. The etched brass that replaces the plastic that we've just removed is colour etched. So there's this part here and this part. So I'm not going to fit them yet until obviously I've painted the green. Then these can just be fitted over the top. So now that I know that, we can go ahead and fit this top piece of the bulkhead together. So just very gently cement that together using some of the Tamiya extra thin. This is the quick setting variety. The seat pad fits like that and the backrest up against the bulkhead like that. So I'll be priming all of these parts that I'm building up in this session and the ones that I did last time, with the exception of these windows, and that's because if I prime the whole part in grey, even though it's masked up. When I took the masking off, I would probably get a grey patch showing on the inside of the plastic. So it spoiled the transparency. So the first paint that's going to go on here is around the window. I'm just going to be applying a bit of the cockpit green. And what will happen then is that the green will reflect on the inside of the transparent plastic rather than the grey if I just prime the whole part. I'll probably just do the patch of green around the windows and then I'll prime the rest in the grey. Once the green's on, the grey's not going to show through the transparency at all. The extra thin cement, this Tamiya extra thin, the quick setting variety, really is the glue that I use most of. Certainly more than the standard formula extra thin, and certainly a lot more than the ordinary brush cement from Tamiya, which is this one. You can see it's an old dusty bottle. I very rarely use that one. I nearly always resort to the extra thin formulas, and most recently the quick setting is my glue of choice for assemblies like this. The next job is to make a start on the instrument panel. This is the instrument panel bulkhead, which also contains the pedal box. I built this up last time in part 1 because I was wanting to make the etched brass pedals. They go here under this mechanism, and this is the pedal box here. The instrument panel sits above, and the detail on the back is all there from Tamiya. These are the instrument pods themselves. It would be possible to add some wire to this to super detail it, but before I do that I would make sure that you're going to be able to see this through the cockpit canopy. I'm not sure that you can see too much of it, so we'll check that out before we spend a lot of time adding cable and wire to the back of this. The way that Tamiya do the instrument panel is in the form of these clear plastic parts which give the representation of the instrument faces, so the clear glass. You can see there. And Tamiya provide decals which are reverse printed. You can't actually see them on the sheet, but when you apply them, obviously the instrument decal shows through this clear glass. I've already done one, which is this one. Just zoom in a little bit. So that's the decal applied to the reverse of the clear plastic, and obviously when you turn it around you can see the instruments, and they're quite nicely done from Tamiya. Tamiya also provide these stainless steel etch pieces which have to be painted black, and then they just fit over the clear plastic like that. So that then gives the impression of looking through the glass and into the instruments behind. So they're quite nice. And I do have some decals in the Barracuda Cals stencil set, just to add some more detail to these panels themselves. I did have an option in the Edward set to use their equivalent brass parts. This is the same part in the Edward set, and it does fit just like the Tamiya one. It's not quite as good a fit, but it does work. And using the Edward set would obviously save the bother of painting the Tamiya panel in black. But there's something about these Edward panels that I just don't like. They're a bit too shiny. The edges aren't quite painted across, so they just don't look as tidy to me as the result I think I can get from the Tamiya panel. So I don't think I'm going to be using the Edward instrument panels at all, which is a bit of a shame really. Edward also provide these backings with the instrument faces on as well, like that. And to get these to look like the Tamiya parts, you'd have to insert a layer of acetate behind there to give the representation of the glass, or a coat of gloss varnish, or just drop some gloss varnish into the instruments themselves. And we get the same result as we get from the Tamiya assembly. But I think overall, all things considered, I think I can do a better job with the original Tamiya parts. So I'm going to be painting this etched steel in black, a satin black. It won't be quite as bright or glossy as the Edward parts. And then I'll use the Barracuda decals to add some stencils to the instrument panels, and hopefully we should get a nice result with that. So I'm going to do the next panel, the decaling, on camera, so to show you how the decals work in the Tamiya kit. So we'll get those ready now and get them applied to this central panel. This is the next decal that I want for this small panel. And this is the etched steel overlay for it. This steel is quite thick. I don't know what gauge it is exactly, but it's fairly thick. So we've got to just make sure that the attachment stubs are filed off. We want it nice and clean around the outside. Just check the fit of that overlay. Just while I'm waiting for this decal to loosen, I just want to show you something else. The Tamiya panel has these very small attachment stubs, you can just see here, which attach onto the grey plastic, so these holes here. And what those attachment points do is just lift these transparent panels away from the grey panel a little bit. So it just gives the impression that they're screwed or bolted onto this panel. That'll give a really nice effect because the transparent parts, the edges, will be painted black, and obviously we'll have the black stainless steel overlays on them, but the panel behind will be painted green. So we'll have the impression of these black panels bolted onto the main aircraft structure. So it should give a really nice impression. But these attachment stubs cause problems if you're using the Edward parts, because you can see that the Edward parts are solid. So they're just a single layer of brass in this case. So if you were using these panels, what you would have to do is either remove the Tamiya attachment points and just glue this to the back, in which case you wouldn't have that effect of the panels being bolted onto the main structure. Or if you wanted to do as Tamiya do, you would have to drill holes in the Edward part to fit around the attachment points, and I think that would be quite awkward. Drilling a pre-painted panel or a pre-printed panel like this, you run the risk of cracking the finish on it. So it would be quite difficult to do, and that's a reason why I'm not using the Edward parts, apart from their appearance, which I don't think is as good as the Tamiya. So with that, we can now fit this decal. You can see that it has a hole in the centre of it, and that is to fit around the attachment point on the rear of the panel. So it's already done for us in the Tamiya kit. So I'm just going to use a little bit of mark fit on the back of the panel. This is mark fit strong, and I'm just trying to work out which way this decal fits. I can always move it around if I get it wrong. I think it goes this way. Just check to see if it aligns with the dial faces. So yeah, we've got that on the right way. Now, to make sure that that decal's in the correct place, I just put the stainless steel panel on the top, and that just enables you to line the instrument decal up exactly into the center. So with the two panels in place, we should end up with an assembly something like that, obviously painted black. So I think they'll look nice. So I'm just going to leave that decal to set in that position. I don't want to be trying to smooth it out because it might just move it a little bit. And if I do that, obviously it won't show properly through the stainless steel panel. So we'll just leave that well alone. So again, just make sure that those are lined up properly. That's quite a tight fit, the decal on the back. It just is shaped perfectly to go around the attachment points. So that's going to work. Leave that to one side, let that decal dry thoroughly. Okay, so we'll just take a look at the instrument panel just before it gets painted, just to check that it's all going to go together as we want it to. There's no reason why it won't. And the last part in the centre here, which is this group of 3 levers, they were for the undercarriage and flaps. That fits in the middle there. So all ready for priming and painting. You'll notice that I haven't scraped the detail off of these Tamiya parts. All of these panels can be replaced with the Edward etch set, so all these pre-painted panels, but I've decided not to, because the problem with using the two-dimensional panels, even though they're pre-painted, is that you've got to remove all this raised detail on the Tamiya parts, and that's such a shame because they're so well done. And when you look at photographs of a Mosquito instrument panel, these were shaped like Tamiya have moulded them. So I don't want to replace them with just some featureless flat brass just because it happens to be painted. There's no reason, because of the fineness of the moulding, there's no reason why they can't be painted to give at least as good, probably better result than the Edward parts. So I'm not going to be using the majority of these. The other problem we've got with pre-painted parts is that when we want to fold them, as we would do in the case of replacing this lever arrangement, is you can see here that when you fold pre-painted brass up, or steel in this case I think it is, the paint cracks off. So that would need painting anyway. And the levers that Edward provide to replace the Tamiya ones are these, and they're really skinny and thin, and they just don't look as smart as the Tamiya ones. I reckon I can do a better job painting this than I can struggling with the Edward pieces, so they're not going to be used, I'm afraid. These levers were for the undercarriage and flaps. And there was the third one, I can't recall the use for it, but when we come to fit it, I'll have looked it up and I'll tell you what those three are for. I think, as you saw in part one, I've also made the replacement brass rudder pedals. These are from the Etched set, but in this case they're a definite improvement on the Tamiya parts, so I shall be using those. And they fit onto the rails underneath the instrument panel, something like that. They're going to need positioning carefully. So that's all ready for priming and painting now. While I've got the primer in the airbrush, I'll also do all the other parts that I've been building over part one of the series and at the beginning of this. But before I do the main fuselage halves, or the nose fuselage halves, I just wanted to check the fit, particularly with the piece of Etched resin that we've got here for the machine gun bay bulkhead. Because I wanted to make sure that all that was going to go together, and I'm glad I did check because I've had to modify it. I'll explain why. So just sliding the cockpit floor into its correct position. So I did this check because I did have some concerns about this machine gun bay bulkhead, which is a resin part from the Etched brassing set. So I just wanted to check for fit, and I'm glad I did, because as it stood, just fitting that straight in, it was preventing the fuselage here just at the top from closing up. It just created a slight gap, probably 1/4 of a millimetre, that was all, but there was still a gap there. So what I did to get the correct fit was to just chamfer the top of the resin here, just to make it thinner. And that means that it can slot into this channel. You can just see the channel on the forward part of the fuselage there. So this bulkhead drops into that channel. And what I was also looking for was that when that bulkhead's in place, it protrudes by the same distance all the way along. So it's just slightly proud. It forms a bit of a shelf all the way around, and I wanted that to be the same sort of distance all the way around the edge of the machine gun bay. And also that the cover for the machine gun bay was going to fit in nice and snugly without any gaps on it. And the resin was slightly interfering with that as well, so what I did was thin the plastic out around here. So I just used a sharp knife blade to thin that reveal out, and that means that when all this is cemented together, that cover is going to go in there nice and flush. So we're not going to have any obvious gaps on that. So now that I know that that bulkhead is going to fit nicely and not interfere with anything, I can go ahead and get all these parts primed and the first coats of paint on them. I just want to do something with this rear seat cushion on the pilot's seat, and that's because Tamiya provide both the backrest and this seat cushion which goes inside. I think actually this is a parachute pack, and I'm not going to be fitting this. The problem with not fitting it is that there's a flat on the bottom of the rear seat pad down here to accommodate this pack, and I don't want to be able to see that, so I'm just going to build it up with some milliput. This is super fine white, it's a 2-part epoxy putty, and I'm just going to use that to build up the bottom of the seat cushion just so it matches the rest of the plastic. The nice thing about this superfine white is that, and all milliput, is that you can mould it with damp cocktail sticks in this case, just to smooth it out and start to model it in the shape that you want. Just smooth it into the rest of the seat pad. So just let that dry, and it might need a bit more texturing once the milliput's dried off, but hopefully that'll look better than the original Tamiya part. This is 0.2mm lead wire that I'm just using to detail the mechanisms around the machine guns. This is the machine gun bay here at the front of the cockpit. This is the resin machine gun bay bulkhead, and we just have one pipe to fit on this just to detail this a little bit. So check coat of primer, that looks all nice and neat, so that's ready for some paint now we've got those cables fitted. Okay, these are the majority of the parts for the cockpit. There are some other bits and pieces, particularly on the starboard sidewall, that I've got to do yet, but these will enable us to get most of the cockpit done. The next step is to give the majority of these parts an overall coat of RAF interior green. So I'll be doing that next, and then I can work out the detail painting that's going to need to be done. The overall painting process will be that we get the base colour on. I'll do a bit of lightened shading on some of the parts just to add a little bit of interest. Then a gloss coat, followed by a wash, followed by the overall matte coat on the top. So there's still quite a bit of work to go on the cockpit, but we'll get the next step sorted out and get the interior green on. So here we are ready to go. Got the colour cup loaded up on the Harder and Steenbeck, and this is Tamiya's XF71 interior green, or cockpit green as they call it, and it's okay for a first overall coat on a 132 scale. I think we'll add some other colour afterwards just to add a bit of interest, so it's not absolutely essential to get a perfect match at this stage. So I've got the airbrush compressor set at, it's around about 12 psi, something like that, so not too powerful. I just want to get some nice light coats of this colour on. Next I'm going to add a little bit of definition to this green. I've just lightened it a bit so that the original colour was XF71, the cockpit green, and I've added a little bit of XF76, which is a Japanese navy green. It's slightly lighter. So there's a mixture of the two in here, just to give a very subtle change in colour, just to provide a bit of highlight to the colour and make it less uniform. The difficulty with big scale kits like this is it can become very easy to get big blocks of colour everywhere. So you just need a bit of definition, I think, to add a bit of interest. So we're just going to very gently blow this into the basic colour. The variation in tone there is so little that it's probably not possible to pick it up with the camera. But it just fades and bleaches the original cockpit green colour a little bit. One suggestion I'd have with lightening any sort of green colour is not to use white in it, because it tends to alter the shade altogether. It makes it a very minty colour, and that's not what we want in this particular instance. The cockpit greens are I would say a brown green, a tan green, so white would completely alter the shade. So normally, to lighten a green like this, I might use a yellow or some sort of very pale tan, and the Japanese navy green has got a lot of tan in it, so it's really altered that but kept the tone of the original cockpit green colour, so that works a lot better. You might just be able to pick out here and on the back deck here where I've used that lightened shade of the cockpit green using the XF76, and it's very subtle, the camera barely picks it up, but that's the idea. I wanted it to be subtle. You don't want a massive patches of colour everywhere. So that's just about right for my taste. But I will use some of the XF76 pure from the bottle rather than mixing it with the cockpit green. I'll use it pure from the bottle to do some dry brushing and highlight some of this great Tamiya detail even more. And using those colours together just maintains the tone of the green rather than introducing a different colour altogether. It's just different intensities of the same colours, and gradually we'll build up the effect that we're looking for highlighting this detail. I've got some black, I've got some semi-gloss black in the airbrush now to do some of the other cockpit parts, starting to work on some of the detail parts now, and also painting the instrument panels. So that's these here. But I'm also going to paint the edges of the clear plastic panels. But to do that, I just want to mask off the dial faces. Don't want to be getting paint on those. Just got a touch of overspray on the panel down here. I will go back and touch that up, but I don't know whether it'll be visible. But doesn't take long to touch that up. Just get rid of the masking from the instrument faces. Okay, with the green done, or started at any rate, it's time to do all the parts that need to be painted black. So I've gathered them all up. These have all been cleaned up, nice and smooth, got rid of all the seam lines on them, and they've been primed with some Mr. Surfacer 1500. So these are all ready to go in black. Some of them will require decaling, so eventually they will have to have a coat of gloss varnish to take the decals. There's some stencils in the Barracuda set and some replacement gauges that fit onto these parts here. So we'll have to gloss coat them at some point, but I want to do them in matte black first of all, because that will accept a dry brushing with some very dark grey before we do the gloss coat and before we do the decaling. So this is loaded with some Tamiya lacquer matte black, and that's thinned as usual about 60% thinners to 40% paint. So we'll get these painted up now. Tamiya's lacquer matte black is a fantastic paint. It dries to a lovely sheen, and I'll retain that sheen by using the matching lacquer varnish on top of that, so it'll retain that nice finish on it after I've fitted the decals. Just doing some dry brushing of the green parts now that I've previously painted, and for the dry brush highlights for the green I'm using the Tamiya XF76. This is the grey green that I use to mix with the basic cockpit green colour to lighten it, and now I'm using this neat from the pot to really create some light edges to the parts, and it really makes the detail pop out. It's a technique that you've got to be gentle with, you don't want to overdo it, but it's really effective, especially on really well detailed and moulded parts like these Tamiya kits. This brush is perfect for dry brushing. It's really old, as you can see. It's not any use for anything else, but it's flat, it's nice and stiff, so it just picks up the paint just enough to get onto the end of the bristle, and you want to just get rid of most of it. You can see the paint coming off onto the kitchen roll. And then it's a case of just gently working around all the raised detail on these parts just to bring it all out. We may lose some of this with the wash process, so I am going to wash these after they've been gloss varnished, but we can always come back and reapply some of this if it loses it a little bit. So you can just see how the dry brush is just catching the detail here on the back of the armour plate, and along the sides this is the seat adjustment handle at the side. This grey green is just enough to highlight this colour. You don't want anything too stark. So that's just gently worked around the parts, and that's a nice effect. The other thing that I like about dry brushing is that when you're using a stiff brush like this, it just scours the finish a little bit. It gets rid of any tiny particles of dust that you might have in the finish. So I really like this step. It makes a big difference to the finish of the parts. So I'll repeat that with all the green parts, and then we need to seal all that with a coat of gloss varnish. Most of the detail on these nose fuselage halves are these little discs all the way around. They're on both sides, and they might appear to be moulding marks in the kit plastic, but they're not. These discs were for mounting pieces of equipment onto. This section of the aircraft was plywood, or at least plywood lined, and these discs were glued onto the plywood just to screw or bolt instruments or other pieces of equipment onto. So don't remove those, don't be tempted to sand them off thinking that the flaws in the plastic. It would be pretty hard to believe that Tamiya would have flaws in the plastic looking like that, but you never know, some people might think that it's a mistake in the kit. So the dry brushing just brings those out a little bit. For all the parts that I've painted black, this is the matte black that I used. I'm going to use some Tamiya German grey. It's a very, very dark grey, and it's just enough to highlight these black parts when you dry brush them. So very, very gentle. We don't want to overdo the effect on these black parts. Just catch the edges, and it just brings that lovely detail out. The dry brushing brings out detail that I never even noticed when I was preparing the part and putting the first coats of paint on. It's only when you do this that you see the fantastic level of moulding that Tamiya have got into these parts. The German grey is perfect on this black. It's just enough to bring the detail out. So that's all the painting done for this stage anyway. And next I want to give this a coat of gloss varnish ready to accept the weathering washes. And for that I'm going to be using some Mr. Colour Super Clear. This is the GX series from Mr. Hobby. And I'll be thinning that something like 50% to some levelling thinners, Mr. Colour levelling thinners. So I'll get that mixed up, get it in the airbrush, and let's get these parts varnished. Okay, so that's all the parts having had a coat of the gloss, and that's just to prepare it really for the weathering washes to follow. It is possible to put a weathering wash onto a matte surface, but it does stain the paint a little bit more than I like. I just want the wash to follow the detail on these parts and just to pop them out a little bit. So that's why I've put the gloss coat on. So that's the next step, together with some detail painting, and we can start to assemble some of the parts that we've been putting together over the last video or two. But because the assembly of this cockpit on the Tamiya kit is so complex, I'll break this video up into two separate parts, and we'll leave this at this stage. It's a good place to break off. But if you want to click the link on the top right hand side of the screen, you'll be able to move straight over to the next part of the build, where we'll do the weathering washes, the detail painting, and we'll start to do some assembly on this. So I'll see you over there.